All right, let's dive deep into The Body Keeps the Score, this groundbreaking work by Bessel van der Kolk. You, our listeners, have handpicked some really thought-provoking sections for us to explore. Today, we're going way beyond just the mind. We're going to unpack how trauma digs deep, affecting us physically, too. And, of course, the big question, how do we even begin to heal from that? And guiding us through this complex world of trauma, we have our expert here.
Glad to be here. You know, it's fascinating what van der Kolk reveals about how incredibly common trauma actually is. It's more pervasive than many realize.
Oh, absolutely. Right off the bat, the book hits us with these stark statistics from the CDC. Get this. 1 in 5 Americans, they've experienced sexual molestation as a child. And 1 in 4, beaten, like really badly by a parent. You can see the marks. These aren't just numbers. These are people we know. Our neighbors, colleagues, friends, maybe even family.
It really underscores the immense hidden suffering in our communities. Like an iceberg, we only see the tip, but underneath, there's this vast amount of pain and struggle.
Powerful analogy. And the book, it doesn't just throw numbers at us. It puts a human face on this hidden suffering through these incredibly personal stories. Like Tom, the Vietnam War vet. On paper, he's the picture of success, valedictorian, Marine, lawyer, family man, the whole 9 yards. But under the surface, he's battling this emotional numbness. Can't connect, not even with his wife.
Tom's story, it really highlights how trauma can lead to this profound disconnect from our emotions, even from ourselves. It's a survival strategy, right? A way to cope with the unbearable. But like we see with Tom, the cost of that disconnect, it's steep.
Makes you wonder, right, how many Toms are out there silently struggling. And then there's Bill, another Vietnam vet. He's doing a Rorschach test, you know, those ink blot things. And bam, a simple ink blot throws him right back into a flashback. Vivid, everything, sights, smells, feelings, just as raw and intense as when the actual trauma happened.
That's trauma for you. It's not just a memory tucked away in the mind. It's stored in the body, an embodied experience ready to resurface when you least expect it. The body, it keeps score, even when the conscious mind wants to move on.
The body keeps score, such a powerful image, and it makes the title of the book, well, even more poignant. But here's a stat that really stopped me in my tracks. More than half the people seeking psychiatric help, they have a history of childhood trauma.
That's huge. It really makes you question, are we truly addressing the root of the problem when we treat mental illness? Are we just putting a Band-Aid on the symptoms without acknowledging the deep-rooted trauma underneath? Those neat little diagnostic boxes, they might not be telling the whole story.
It's like patching up cracks in the wall while the foundation's crumbling, Riz. We might see the cracks, but we're missing the bigger picture. This brings Tom and Bill's struggles into sharper focus, doesn't it? They're not isolated cases. It's part of a much larger phenomenon.
Exactly. It's about context. To truly understand and treat mental illness, we have to consider the individual's life experiences, particularly their experiences with trauma.
And it's not just recent trauma, right? Even stuff buried deep in the past. It can have this ripple effect. The book mentions this guy, Eugen Bleuler. Back in 1911, he observed that patients diagnosed with schizophrenia often had these sexual hallucinations. He believed many of these hallucinations actually stemmed from real sensations they'd experienced.
Now connect that to the high prevalence of childhood sexual abuse we've been talking about. It's a game changer. How much of what we label as mental illness might be rooted in unaddressed trauma? It challenges everything we thought we knew about mental health.
Makes you think, doesn't it? Like we're just scratching the surface. And, you know, there's this other thing, how trauma affects something you wouldn't necessarily expect. Physical coordination.
You're right. Van der Kolk observed this in his patients. People who had experienced trauma, they often struggled with physical tasks. Simple things, pitching a tent, balancing a boat, they became hurdles.
And it wasn't just about completing the tasks. It was like this disruption in their flow, even conversations. It's like they couldn't find that natural back and forth rhythm. Their sense of timing, it was off.
That points to a disruption at a deeper level in their body awareness. Trauma, it seems to fragment our sense of self in a very fundamental way.
Which makes sense, right? Trauma often involves this feeling of being completely out of control, disconnected from your body, from your surroundings. It's like you're not fully there. And this reminds me of Freud's idea, the compulsion to repeat those traumatic experiences. But the book, it challenges the idea that these reenactments actually lead to mastery.
Huge difference there. Reenacting trauma, it often just reinforces it, traps individuals in this vicious cycle of suffering. It's not about gaining control. It's about seeking something familiar, even if that familiarity is rooted in pain.
It's like that saying, we repeat what we don't repair. And there's a study mentioned in the book. It found that activities that initially cause fear or pain, like running marathons, even parachute jumping, they can become, well, thrilling over time.
The body, it adapts to stress in these incredible, sometimes puzzling ways. But that adaptation, it can lead us down a tricky path. We start seeking out risky, even painful situations, almost as if we're drawn to what's familiar, even if it's harmful.
It's like we get addicted to that adrenaline rush, even when it's tied to a negative experience. And this brings us to the brain scan research, the one done with trauma survivors. Groundbreaking stuff.
This research provided hard evidence. We could actually see how trauma, it leaves its mark on the brain, changing the way it functions.
They saw increased activity in the amygdala, the brain's fear center, even years after the traumatic event. This explains why survivors experience those symptoms, the hypervigilance, the sleeplessness, the irritability. Their bodies are stuck in this constant fight-or-flight mode, even when there's no real threat.
It's like their internal alarm system is on high alert 24/7, always scanning for danger, even when they're safe. And that constant state of alert, well, it takes its toll on their physical and mental health.
Here's the kicker. During flashbacks, the scans, they actually showed decreased activity in Broca's area. That's the speech center of the brain.
Makes sense, doesn't it? This explains why survivors struggle to put their thoughts and feelings into words during a flashback. They literally become speechless with horror. Their ability to communicate, it's hijacked by those overwhelming emotions and physical sensations.
It's like their trauma is silencing them, preventing them from expressing their pain and seeking help. It makes you realize how limited talk therapy can be when it comes to trauma. If words fail, how do we even access those deeply embedded traumatic memories, let alone process them?
That's where it gets really interesting. The book, it dives into all these therapies that go beyond just talking. Therapies that focus on the body, on how it holds on to trauma and how we can help it let go. It's a whole new way of thinking about healing.
It's like we're finally starting to understand that trauma is this full-body experience, demanding a much more holistic approach to treatment. And speaking of the body, the book talks about this thing called the emotional brain, which includes the reptilian brain and the limbic system.
Think of the emotional brain as our survival control center.
Yeah.
It's all about staying alive, even if that means triggering these intense, visceral sensations that completely override rational thought.
So basically, during a traumatic situation, the emotional brain takes over, even if it makes decisions that, well, logically aren't the best.
Spot on. The emotional brain, it doesn't think, it reacts.
Yeah.
It's all about instinct and survival, not careful deliberation or logic.
Now it makes sense why trauma survivors often struggle with emotional regulation, why their emotions sometimes feel so overwhelming. It's like their emotional brain is calling the shots, and their rational brain is playing catch-up.
Exactly. And understanding that dynamic is key to developing therapies that actually help survivors regulate their emotional responses and reclaim control. The book delves into specific parts of the brain impacted by trauma, like the ventral vagal complex, or VVC.
Okay, VVC, I might need a bit of help with that one. What exactly is it, and how does it tie into all of this?
Well, imagine the VVC as our social engagement system. It's what allows us to feel safe and connected with others, to have those social interactions without feeling threatened or overwhelmed.
So what you're saying is trauma messes with this system.
That's it. When someone goes through trauma, their VVC can get all out of whack, making it much harder to feel safe and connect with others. And then there's the dorsal vagal complex, the DVC, which is responsible for the freeze response and dissociation.
So trauma basically pushes us toward isolation and disconnection, right? It makes it that much harder to reach out for the very support we need to heal.
A vicious cycle. Trauma isolates. Isolation deepens the trauma. That's why restoring the VVC is so vital for recovery. We need to help survivors feel safe and connected to break free from that cycle of isolation.
It makes you wonder, how many people are struggling with social anxiety or feeling isolated because of unresolved trauma? It all starts to connect, doesn't it? And this leads us to the importance of secure attachment in early childhood. The book talks a lot about that.
Attachment. It's the bedrock of human development. It shapes who we become, our ability to manage our emotions, our capacity for healthy relationships throughout life.
And parental attunement, right, where parents respond to their child's needs, to their emotions, with sensitivity. They create this safe haven where the child feels secure to explore the world, knowing they have a safe base to come back to when things get rough.
But when that attunement is missing, it can have a huge impact on the child's development. They might struggle with anxiety, have trouble regulating their emotions, and find it really hard to build trusting relationships.
Like Sherry, the woman in the book, kidnapped and raped. When she finally escaped, she called her mother for help, and her mother refused to even take the call. That's just heartbreaking.
It is. Sherry's story, it's a devastating example of the impact of neglect. And it highlights the critical need for safe, supportive relationships, especially during those early years. It's like her entire foundation was shattered, and she was left to rebuild it all on her own.
It's a stark reminder of what happens when secure attachment is missing, but it also underscores the power of early intervention. If we can support families, create those loving, secure environments for children, imagine how much suffering we could prevent.
Absolutely. Investing in early childhood, it's investing in a healthier future for everyone.
The book delves into some research showing decreased activity in the self-sensing areas of the brain in people with chronic PTSD. That's fascinating.
Isn't it? Think about it. If the very parts of your brain responsible for feeling present, connected to your body, able to experience your emotions, if those parts are underactive, it's no wonder those with PTSD struggle to feel real, whole.
So the numbness, the disconnection that many trauma survivors describe, it's not just in their heads. It's a physiological response, something happening in their brains.
Precisely. Their brains have adapted to trauma in a way that makes it incredibly difficult to connect, to feel. It's a survival strategy, but it comes at a huge cost.
It makes therapies that address the whole person, mind, body, spirit that much more crucial, wouldn't you say?
Couldn't agree more. We can't just focus on thoughts and feelings. We have to address the body, the nervous system, help survivors reconnect with themselves, with the world around them.
And that brings us to developmental trauma disorder, a term used to describe the unique challenges faced by those who experience trauma during their formative years.
It's interesting. The book, it expresses frustration with the fact that this disorder isn't officially recognized in the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. It highlights a gap in our understanding. We need a more nuanced approach to diagnosing and treating trauma, especially when it happens during childhood.
It's like the system isn't equipped to handle the complexities of trauma, especially when it occurs during those crucial developmental years. We need to keep pushing for a better understanding.
Absolutely. It's not just about slapping a label on it. It's about recognizing the specific needs and challenges of individuals who were traumatized as children. We need to develop therapies and interventions that target those specific needs, help them heal and thrive.
And speaking of understanding the impact of trauma, the book delves into the ACE study, the Adverse Childhood Experiences study. It revealed this groundbreaking connection between childhood trauma and a whole host of health and social issues.
The ACE study, it was a game changer. It showed us that the more ACE someone experiences, the higher their risk for negative outcomes down the line. We're talking heart disease, cancer, mental illness, substance abuse, you name it.
It's incredible, really, how those early experiences can have such a profound and lasting impact on our physical and mental well-being. It's like this ripple effect, extending far beyond the initial trauma.
And that's why prevention and early intervention are so critical. We can't just wait for those problems to surface. We need to invest in strategies that support families, promote healthy child development, create environments where children can truly thrive.
And the book highlights the benefits of investing in those quality early childhood programs, like home visitation, preschool, those kinds of things.
These programs, they have a proven track record. Positive long-term effects on development, well-being, it's all there. They offer support to families, promote healthy attachment, and provide early learning opportunities and socialization, all crucial elements.
And let's not forget the economic argument. The book mentions James Heckman's research. He found a significant return on investment for every dollar spent on those early childhood programs.
It's a no-brainer, really. We're talking reduced healthcare costs, lower crime rates, increased productivity. The benefits are undeniable, both for individuals and for society as a whole.
Investing in our children, it's investing in our future. Pretty straightforward.
Absolutely. And this leads us to a crucial shift in how we understand trauma, recognizing the body's central role in both storing and releasing it.
Now we're getting to the heart of it. The book emphasizes that trauma, it's not just in our minds, it gets embedded in our bodies, manifesting as chronic pain, tension, and difficulty regulating emotions.
It's like our bodies keep this detailed record of our experiences, holding on to the tension, the fear, even when our minds have moved on.
So we can't just talk about trauma, we have to address those physical manifestations too.
Exactly. The book explores a variety of body-based therapies: yoga, somatic experiencing, sensorimotor psychotherapy. These approaches help people reconnect with their bodies, release that trapped trauma.
It makes you think about traditional exposure therapy for PTSD, where you relive those traumatic memories in detail. I can see how that could be really intense, even re-traumatizing for some.
It's a valid concern. While exposure therapy can be helpful for some, when done carefully and with the right support, it's definitely not for everyone. It's about finding a therapist who knows how to use it safely and effectively. It shouldn't feel like ripping open a wound that hasn't healed yet.
It's a lot to process for sure. And I guess that brings up a practical question. If someone is listening to this, realizing, hey, maybe I need help, where do they even start? How do you find the right therapist for this kind of stuff?
It's so important, that question. Not all therapists are created equal, especially when we're talking about trauma. van der Kolk, he really stresses finding someone who specializes in trauma, who understands the nuances.
So not just any therapist will do, right? You need someone with specific expertise in trauma.
Exactly. Don't be shy about asking potential therapists about their training, their experience working with trauma. A good therapist will be upfront about that. They'll understand why it matters. It's about finding the right fit.
Right. Qualifications are key. But beyond that, what should someone look for?
Trust your gut. You have to feel comfortable and safe with that person, like you can open up, be vulnerable without judgment. Therapy, it's a partnership. You're working together on this journey of healing. So that trust, that connection, it's essential.
I can see that, especially if you've experienced a betrayal of trust. Opening up to someone new can be terrifying.
You're absolutely right. And jumping into reliving traumatic memories before that foundation of trust and safety is there, it can backfire. It can be really damaging, like opening a wound that hasn't had a chance to heal.
And the book, it explores some alternative therapies that, well, they might not be the first things that come to mind when you think about trauma.
True. It's not all about talking. Sometimes words, they just get in the way, especially for experiences that are pre-verbal, before you even had the language to make sense of what was happening, or nonverbal, so overwhelming that they shut down your ability to express them, like we saw with those brain scans.
Makes sense. So the book delves into these body-based therapies, right? Things like yoga, somatic experiencing, sensorimotor psychotherapy. They focus on helping people get back in touch with their bodies, learn to regulate their nervous systems. It seems intuitive, right? If trauma gets trapped in the body, you have to address it on a physical level. It's not just about changing your thoughts. It's about working with those bodily sensations, those reactions that are stuck there.
Exactly. It's about tuning into your body's signals, releasing the tension, building that sense of safety and grounding, re-inhabiting your body in a way that feels safe and strong.
The book talks about the limitations of traditional exposure therapy for PTSD. That idea of reliving those traumatic memories in vivid detail, it just seems so intense. I imagine it could be really triggering for some people, like ripping a bandage off a wound that's still raw.
I agree. Exposure therapy can be helpful, but it's got to be done very carefully with the right support, and it's not right for everyone. Finding a therapist who really understands how to use it safely, that's key. It's not about forcing someone to relive their trauma over and over. It's about helping them process those memories in a way that feels manageable, that leads to a sense of control.
So if exposure therapy is not an option, what are the alternatives?
EMDR is one that's discussed in the book. Eye movement, desensitization, and reprocessing. It's showing a lot of promise in treating PTSD. It involves stimulating both sides of the brain, usually with eye movements, while you're focusing on that traumatic memory.
I've heard about EMDR, but I'm not sure I understand how it works. It sounds almost too simple.
I know, right? It seems deceptively simple.
Yeah.
The idea is that by stimulating both hemispheres of the brain, EMDR helps to unlock those traumatic memories that are stuck, fragmented. It's like creating new neural pathways that bypass those old traumatic ones, paving the way for healing.
So it's not about erasing the memory. It's about changing how your brain responds to it.
You got it. It's about taking the sting out of that memory so it doesn't trigger that same intense fear, anxiety. The book suggests it's especially effective for single-event traumas like car accidents, natural disasters.
That makes sense. But what about those more complex traumas, the ones that aren't tied to a single event, but something that happened over a long period, like childhood abuse or neglect?
It gets a bit trickier there. EMDR can still be a useful tool, But it often needs to be part of a bigger picture, more comprehensive approach. You have to address the deeper wounds, the impact on relationships, development, that kind of thing. It's about working through those ingrained beliefs, those patterns that develop as a result of prolonged exposure to trauma.
Okay, so a multi-pronged approach is needed for those more complex cases. And the book also talks about this thing called psychomotor therapy. I have to admit, I'm not familiar with that one at all. What's that about?
Psychomotor therapy, it's all about using movement, physical expression, to access and process those traumatic memories. The core idea is that trauma, it's not just in our minds, it lives in our bodies too. So by working with the body, we can release that trauma, create healthier ways of relating to ourselves and the world.
It reminds me of what we were discussing earlier about the body keeping score. It's like movement, physical expression. It becomes a way for the body to finally let go of that score.
Exactly. It's giving the body a voice, a way to express what words can't always capture. And the book shares some amazing stories about how psychomotor therapy has helped people overcome a wide range of challenges: anxiety, depression, relationship issues, even chronic pain.
It sounds incredibly empowering to reclaim your body that way, to rewrite your story through movement.
It is. And it's not just about the physical release. It's about developing that deeper connection with your body, learning to trust its signals, its wisdom, its capacity to heal.
There's another therapy mentioned in the book that's really intriguing: neurofeedback. It seems pretty different from the others we've discussed.
Neurofeedback is really fascinating. It's a type of biofeedback, basically. It measures your brainwave activity and gives you feedback in real time so you can learn to regulate your own brain function.
I've heard of biofeedback for things like stress reduction, but how does it apply to trauma?
Trauma can really mess with your brainwave patterns, and those disruptions, they contribute to all sorts of symptoms: anxiety, feeling on edge all the time, trouble concentrating, emotional roller coasters. Neurofeedback aims to retrain the brain to get those patterns back on track, kind of like hitting the reset button.
So you're basically rewiring your brain from the inside out.
That's a great way to put it. The research is still in its early stages, but there's growing evidence that neurofeedback can be a really valuable tool for trauma recovery. It can help reduce symptoms, improve overall well-being, often in conjunction with those more traditional therapies.
It's amazing how technology can play a role in healing from trauma. We're really starting to understand the brain in new ways. And the book also highlights something I never would have thought of: the unique benefits of theater for trauma survivors.
Oh, theater is incredible for this. It provides this safe space, structured, where you can explore those difficult emotions, practice new ways of relating to others. It's a powerful way to regain that sense of agency, that feeling of empowerment, especially for those who felt so powerless because of their trauma.
It's like a form of expressive therapy, right? You get to step into different roles, embody different emotions, step outside your usual patterns, and experiment with new ways of being.
Exactly. And the book talks about how theater can help rebuild trust, create a sense of community, a space for shared healing. It's not just about individual recovery. It's about connecting with others, finding a sense of belonging.
The book mentions some really inspiring programs. I remember reading about Shakespeare in the Courts, the one that works with incarcerated youth. It's just incredible the impact that something like acting out Shakespeare can have.
It shows how the arts can break down barriers, forge connections. Theater gives people an outlet to express themselves authentically, to tap into their creativity, to connect with others in a meaningful way. It's about finding your voice, reclaiming your story.
And there was another program mentioned, Trauma Drama, specifically for trauma survivors. What can you tell us about that one?
Trauma Drama, it uses techniques from drama therapy: role-playing, improvisation, storytelling, movement, all designed to help participants work through their trauma, develop coping skills, and build a stronger sense of self. It's a safe, creative space to explore those difficult experiences and emotions.
It's like giving the trauma a form, something you can interact with, work through outside of yourself.
You got it. It's about finding ways to express and process the trauma without feeling completely overwhelmed by it. It's about taking back that control, creating a new narrative that's not centered around the trauma.
It's fascinating how all these different approaches, the body-based therapies, EMDR, neurofeedback, even theater, they all seem to converge on this idea of reconnecting with your body, regulating your emotions, rewiring your brain for healing.
It's all connected, isn't it? Trauma is complex, multifaceted. There's no magic bullet. It's about finding the right combination of therapies and approaches that resonate with each individual, honoring their unique story.
And this leads us to the final section of the book, where the focus shifts from individual healing to creating those trauma-informed communities.
Yes, this is where it all comes together. We can't just focus on treating individual trauma. We have to address the bigger picture, those societal factors that contribute to trauma in the first place. We have to create communities and systems that prevent trauma and support healing, that understand its pervasive impact.
And the book talks about the need for trauma-informed schools, right? Where teachers and staff are trained to recognize and respond to the impact of trauma to create that safe, supportive learning environment for all students.
Absolutely. It's about shifting away from punishment, moving towards understanding, compassion, support, recognizing that behavior is communication.
It's about asking, what happened to this child, instead of what's wrong with this child.
Exactly. It's about fostering a culture of care and understanding, recognizing that challenging behaviors are often a sign of unmet needs. And by addressing those needs, we can help children heal and thrive.
The book also talks about trauma-informed healthcare, where patients are treated with dignity and respect, where their experiences are acknowledged and validated.
That's crucial, especially for people who've experienced multiple traumas, complex trauma. They're often misdiagnosed, mistreated within those traditional healthcare settings. It's heartbreaking.
It's like they're re-traumatized by the very systems that are supposed to be helping them.
It's a painful reality. We need to push for change, a systemic shift that prioritizes the well-being of trauma survivors, moving away from judgment, blame, towards empathy, support.
The book also mentions the need for trauma-informed legal systems. It talks about how the legal process itself can be re-traumatizing for victims of crime.
Absolutely. The way our legal system is set up, it can be really triggering. The focus on cross-examination, on punishment, the adversarial nature of it all, it can bring up all those traumatic memories and responses. We need to find ways to make the legal system more sensitive to the needs of trauma survivors.
It's about recognizing everyone's humanity, creating a system that focuses on healing, restoration, instead of just punishment, retribution. It's about justice that truly serves everyone involved.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that idea, that sense of interconnectedness, recognizing our shared humanity, it brings us back to Ubuntu, that beautiful philosophy from Africa that the book highlights. A powerful framework for healing not just individual trauma, but collective trauma.
Ubuntu, that word meaning humanity toward others, it's such a powerful concept. Yeah. And the book connects it to the work of the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission, how they chose forgiveness and understanding over revenge and punishment.
It's such a powerful example. It shows us that when we acknowledge our interconnectedness, when we build a society based on compassion and understanding, we can begin to address the widespread impact of trauma. It's not just about individual healing, it's about collective healing. It's about recognizing that we are all in this together, that what affects one of us affects us all.
So if we're all connected and trauma affects one person, it affects us all in some way. It ripples outward, impacting our families, our communities, our entire society.
That's right. And that means healing from trauma. It's not just an individual responsibility, it's a collective responsibility.
Yeah.
We need to cultivate a culture where people feel safe to share their experiences, where they're met with compassion, understanding, and where they have access to the resources and support they need to heal.
It's a big vision, but it feels possible. The book gives me hope, this belief that we can create a world where trauma is acknowledged, understood, and addressed with care and compassion.
I feel that hope too. The book doesn't sugarcoat the realities of trauma, but it shows us that healing is possible for individuals and for our communities.
You know, it feels like this whole conversation has been building towards something bigger. We've explored the science, heard those personal stories, looked at all these different therapies. But what does it all mean for us? I mean, as individuals, as a society, where do we even go from here?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Trauma is so widespread, the impact's so profound, we can't just address it on an individual level. It has to be bigger than that. We need a total shift in how we understand and respond to trauma as a society.
And the book, it kind of hints at that all along, right? Like that statistic about women who experience childhood abuse being more likely to be re-victimized later in life. It's like their trauma made them a target.
That's one of the truly insidious things about trauma, how it perpetuates itself. It influences our choices, our relationships, how we see the world, how we interact with it. It creates this vulnerability that can, sadly, make individuals more susceptible to further harm.
So it's not just about treating the trauma, it's about preventing it from happening in the first place. That's a huge undertaking.
It is. And awareness is the first step. The ACE study, it was a real eye-opener for a lot of people. Showed us just how far-reaching the consequences of those adverse childhood experiences are. The higher your ACE score, the greater your risk for all these problems later in life. physical health issues, mental illness, even early death.
It's scary when you think about it. How many people have experienced at least one ACE? And the book, it makes such a strong case for investing in early intervention, those programs that support families, that focus on healthy child development.
Those programs, they're where real change happens. Things like home visitation, access to quality preschool, they have a proven track record. It's about breaking the cycle before it even starts.
The book also talked about the economic arguments in favor of those programs.
Right, it's not just about doing the right thing, it's about smart investments. James Heckman, his research showed this incredible return on investment for every dollar spent on early childhood programs.
It seems so obvious, doesn't it? But getting funding for these programs can be a real uphill battle. We end up spending billions on healthcare, on incarceration after the damage is done, instead of investing in prevention up front.
It all comes down to priorities, right?
Yeah.
We need to shift our focus, move away from just reacting to problems toward preventing them. Instead of treating the symptoms, let's address the root causes. We need to become a trauma-informed society.
And the book doesn't stop at early childhood. It talks about those trauma-informed schools, healthcare systems, even the legal system. It's like we need to rethink how all these institutions interact with people who might be carrying trauma.
That's exactly it. We have to understand that trauma affects everything. Our behavior, our decisions, our ability to trust, to connect. It's about creating systems that respond with compassion, with support, not with judgment or punishment. It's about understanding and creating environments that promote healing and resilience.
That's a big ask, changing an entire culture. But the book makes a compelling case that it's not just possible, it's absolutely crucial if we want to create a society that's truly just and compassionate.
And it doesn't have to be these huge gestures, these sweeping policy changes. It starts with those everyday acts of kindness, understanding. It's about listening to each other, validating each other's experiences, creating spaces where people feel safe to be vulnerable. It's about recognizing that shared humanity.
Like those theater programs we talked about, creating those spaces where emotions can be expressed, where stories can be shared, where people can connect through art, through shared experiences.
Exactly. And it circles back to Ubuntu, that concept of interconnectedness, of recognizing our shared humanity. It reminds us that we're all in this together, that our well-being is intertwined.
So where do we go from here? We've learned so much from The Body Keeps the Score. If there's one thing you want our listeners to take away from this deep dive, what would it be?
Trauma is everywhere. So the question is, how can each of us contribute to building a world where everyone feels safe, seen, supported? It's not someone else's problem. It's a collective responsibility. Start small, within your own circle, your family, your workplace, your community. How can you embody those principles of trauma-informed care? How can you be that source of healing, of connection? Those small acts, multiplied across millions of people, they can create a waves of change, transforming our world.
That's beautiful and hopeful. This deep dive, it's been intense, but ultimately it's a call to action. Understanding trauma is the first step, but then we have to do something about it. Prevent it, heal it. We encourage you to keep exploring this topic, find those resources, and find your own way to contribute to creating a more trauma-informed world. Thanks for joining us on this journey.